All right, quick prologue recap. The good creator king, Yahweh, created the world to be good. Everything had a form, everything had a function to it. God gifted these forms and these functions to the chaotic, watery abyss that was the world. And in his goodness, God gives power away to his image bearers. These image bearers are responsible for furthering God's will in the world. In the non-physical world, God has non-physical image bearers, the celestial beings, the sons of God, what most people refer to as angel, although that's a very broad term and not near specific enough for all of the ancient Hebrew nuances to the term. But the Hebrew encompassing term is Elohim, which is just the word for gods. So you can call any celestial being, any non-physical being, a god. That does not mean that there is more than one Yahweh. Yahweh is not like the other celestial beings. But I tend to stick to the term celestial. God is a celestial being, but he is something wholly and completely other than other celestial beings. In the physical world, God has physical image bearers. That's us. Humans are his physical image bearers. These image bearers in his creation are imbued with his own status to rule their respective domains under Yahweh's authority. Yet, these image bearers are not programmed robots. Like God, these image bearers are free to choose between obedience to God and rebellion against God. And some celestials have chosen rebellion, but all humans have rebelled against God, the good creator king. These rebellions took place over three major events and at three major places that we've already covered in the Genesis prologue. The first one was where? Eden. That's the most obvious one. That's the one everybody knows about. The celestial rebel was who? Not quite. No, the celestial rebel in Eden.
Oh, the snake.
Yeah, the snake, who the New Testament refers to as? Satan, yeah. Not trying to trick you. These are obvious answers. I'm just trying to get you to say them. So the serpent, he tricks Adam and Eve, humanity, because that's what Adam and Eve are. Humanity reaches out, they eat the forbidden fruit, they choose autonomy from God rather than living under God. They don't want to rule underneath his authority. And so now we all believe that we know good and evil, and we define right and wrong in our own terms rather than actually believing God's revelation, what God says is right and wrong. And so we're kicked out of the garden. Humans start multiplying outside of the garden. And then we came to the second rebellion. The location in Second Temple Judaism was Hermon, a mountain range in the North Israel area. It's also a specific mountain. But so what happens here is that celestial sons, celestial beings called the sons of God, they leave their heavenly home for earth so that they could shack up and sleep with women. And this births the Nephilim. These celestial beings partnered with terrestrial women to birth the Nephilim, which meant giant. They built a world based on illicit access to things like magic, idolatry. They lured humanity into worshiping and serving them and building a world around them, and it was guided by, hey, we'll give you all this information you don't have. We'll teach you how to build weapons. We'll teach you how to warfare. And humanity descends into this violent state of corruption. And the corruption of the world by these people was away from God's good intentions. Rather than actually establishing God's good intentions, they lure humanity away. So God hits the cosmic reset button. He unleashes the floodwaters of pre-creation, and he recreates the world through Noah's family. That is the point of Noah's flood, and we should read it as a recreation story. Creation in Genesis 1 is out of the chaotic, watery abyss. And God tames that watery abyss. He overpowers it, and he creates life with form and function to flourish. The flood is God saying, yeah, I'm done with you. We're going to unleash all this cosmic chaos because you people have unleashed cosmic chaos in the world. So I'm going to unleash even greater cosmic chaos and destroy you, and then start over through Noah and his family. So Noah, his three sons, all their wives, they make it through the flood. They come back out on the other side, and they start rebuilding humanity. And where humanity is supposed to multiply and spread out, instead, in the third rebellion, they gather where? Babel. Also known as the plain of Shinar. But they build a tower here, and that tower eventually becomes called the Tower at Babel, or of Babel. Humanity initiates this rebellion. This is the third and climactic rebellion, in part because humanity is initiating it. They want to initiate reaching out to the celestials, to the heavenly realm, the celestial realm, and tempting the gods to come down because they're building a tower, which we called a what? A ziggurat. Very good. He's going to keep beating you guys in jeopardy when these questions come up if you don't beat him to the answers, A ziggurat tower. It was a portal. In their minds, when heaven and earth overlap, their tower is not designed to get humans into the heavenly realm. That's not how the ancients think. They're trying to lure the gods down. And they get more than they bargained for because God does indeed come down. And he looks at their work and he says, I've had enough of humanity's rebellion. So he divorces the nations. He divides the nations into the 70 nations of Genesis 10. Each having their own language, each having their own territory, but also each having what? Their own...
step god.
Yeah, they're step gods. Very good. You can say it that way. God puts members of his own divine council over... He divides them up. He puts them over each of these nations, and he says, I'm done with you guys. I want you sons of mine to guide and govern these nations until I'm ready to claim them. But the expectation is you're going to do a good job. You're going to guide these people, and instead they do a really bad job. They're supposed to do a good job so that when God comes back to the nations and reclaims them again, whenever that's going to be in the future, they're ready to just step back into God's kingdom. They're ready to live underneath him. But instead, these Elohim, these gods, these celestial beings, they decide they really like being worshipped. Just like the rebellious sons in Genesis 2, just like the serpent in Genesis 1, they would rather have their way and rebel against God. So we looked at Psalm 82, and we see God calling them to account. He says, how long are you guys going to judge unjustly? How long are you going to refuse to take up the cause of the fatherless and the widow? I put you in charge of these nations for a reason, and you are failing. Therefore, you will die like mortal men. So, God is at the third rebellion is essentially giving humanity what they want. You want to worship and call out to other gods? I will give you other gods to worship and call out to. But since they're not me, they are fallible, imperfect beings, and they're going to lead you into fallible, imperfect ways of living. And it turns out they're going to corrupt themselves more and more over time. And as a result, humanity worshiping them is going to get further and further and further away from their intended purpose of worshiping God and living under God's reign. These are the three rebellions that have created the world that we live in today. When you're asking yourself, why is the world so screwed up? Your answer is the good creator God created the world to function one way, but he gave his image bearers, both sets of his one family, free will, and members of those families have rebelled against him. The world is screwed up because we rebel. It's not God's doing. And God is going to do something about his world being so screwed up. God the Creator is going to call a man named Abram out of this Babel system and make him into a new humanity. Turn him into a new nation. And that new nation is going to be God's portion, according to Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9. He's divorced all the other nations. Now he's going to take a man out of those nations, turn him into a new nation, and that one nation is going to be God's portion among the nations. That's going to be Israel. Israel, starting with the call of Abram, is God's solution to Babel, to Hermon, and to Eden, to the rebellions themselves. So here's what we're going to talk about today, and then we'll start reading the scriptures. And I'll read the first portion because it's largely names, so that'll help confusing. So what happens to the seed since Noah's day? We've been tracking the seed since God made the promise in Genesis 3:15. Where is the bloodline? What has happened to it now that Babel has taken place and the nations are divided? We're going to find that out. We're going to find that God calls Abram out of Ur into a land called Canaan. God graciously makes promises to this man, Abram, that if he will walk in faith, he will get certain promises. And these promises are designed to address the three rebellions. And ultimately, it will be through Abram's seed that God will deal with the world's rebellion and bring about restoration. And the curses of Genesis 3 that the world is now living under will be turned back into blessings. So let's look at Genesis 11, starting in verse 10. I will read these names, and we won't spend a whole lot of time here, but it's worth reading. As I've told you before, I don't want you to skip genealogies. They're very important. But we'll summarize this information and we'll move on. Starting in 11:10, this is the account of Shem's family line. 2 years after the flood, when Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arphaxad. And after he became the father of Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and had other sons and daughters. When Arphaxad had lived 35 years, he became the father of Shelah. After he became the father of Shelah, Arphaxad lived 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Shelah had lived 30 years, he became the father of Eber. And after he became the father of Eber, Shelah lived 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Eber had lived 34 years, he became the father of Peleg. Peleg, remember, his name has already come up in Genesis 10. His name means divide because he was this son was the one around or born right after probably the Babel incident. And so he's being named after that. The father of Peleg, verse 17. And after he became the father of Peleg, Eber lived 430 years and had other sons and daughters. And when Peleg had lived 30 years, he became the father of Reu. After he became the father of Reu, Peleg lived 209 years. He had other sons and daughters. When Reu had lived 32 years, he became the father of Serug. After he became the father of Serug, Reu lived 207 years and had other sons and daughters. When Serug had lived 30 years, he became the father of Nahor. After he became the father of Nahor, Serug lived 200 years and had other sons and daughters. When Nahor had lived 29 years, he became the father of Terah. After he became the father of Terah, Nahor lived 119 years and had other sons and daughters. After Terah had lived 70 years, he became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. All right, so let's talk just that much. Once again, I thought you had a question. Once again, we have an account of and a family line. Again, the Hebrew word toledot. There are 10 of these. Technically, there's 11 in the book of Genesis, but 10 of them matter. And each of these 10 toledots, written accounts or generations in Genesis, each have 10 people in their names. So you can see my summaries of all 10 of them down here from a previous slide that I've used, screenshotted here. So we're on the fourth one right here. The family account of Shem takes us 10 names down to Terah is 9, Abram is 10, and Abraham, Nahor, and Haran are all 3 brothers. So this is 10 generations from Shem to Abraham. Abram, Abraham. Again, I'll use these names interchangeably. But I'll try until we get to chapter 15 when his name is changed to Abraham to stick to Abram. So what you want to note out of this is that although genealogies are considered boring and you want to skip them, you shouldn't do that because this is a literary device trying to tell you something about the structure of the book of Genesis. 10 accounts of the family line from Adam down to Jacob. Cain gets one too, but he's not part of this bloodline. And his bloodline is presumably wiped out by the flood. These 10 structured with 10 names tell you the literary structure of the book of Genesis. They tell you something about what the overall book is about, and it's moving you into a new set of the story. What it's doing is moving away from the prologue, specifically away from Babel now, because a lot of these names have come up before Babel, and it's moving us away from Babel and into the patriarchs. The story is doing that by summarizing and then moving on. So we summarize the generations from Noah to Shem to Terah's son throughout Genesis 5 through now 11. In Genesis 5, we get 10 generation genealogies from Adam to Noah. Now the author gives us a 10 generation genealogy from Shem, Noah's son, down to Abram. So he's picking and choosing the number of names he's going to include for a literary reason. He's summarizing the passage of time. He's also showing continuity with God's work from the previous stories into his present stories. So if you're talking about how do you read an ancient Hebrew story, and you need to summarize a lot of events and names, well, here's a good way to picture it. You're moving away from Babel and down through Shem's bloodline, down to Terah, and Terah's bloodline through Abram. So this is kind of a visual representation of moving away from this. The similarities between these two genealogies in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11 are suggesting that the author is actually intelligent in performing a specific task. He's counting to 10 multiple times, in fact, doing it 10 times. I think he's on to something here. He's tracing the bloodline of the seed. That's what he's trying to do. The seed from Eden, through Hermon and Noah, down through the flood, and now from the flood to Babel, and now through the Babel incident down to Adam. And so what genealogies are wanting to do is start with a particular person, and then they move out and they kind of talk about everybody, and then they immediately narrow their focus to a new guy. And then the story picks up, and then they say, okay, here's what you need to know about Noah. And it tells you everything you need to know about Noah, his family, and then it'll immediately, through a genealogy, narrow its focus again to a new character. That's Hebrew storytelling. Yeah, Grant gets it. That's Grant. So what you see here is that God is faithful. He's faithful to deal with the serpent and his rebellious followers. From the first rebellion down through the third and the dividing of the nations, God is faithfully keeping his promises to deal with the serpent, his rebellious followers, be they celestial, be they terrestrial. He's tracing the bloodline of Adam and Eve and the seed that God promised. And he will continue to trace this bloodline, this seed, through Abram. And Abraham's going to have a lot of sons in the end. It's going to take a long time, but man, he's going to have some kids eventually. And it's going to narrow its focus to one of Abraham's sons out of all of Abraham's sons. So the Bible is going to keep doing this. The Old Testament does this a lot. Of all of Abraham's sons, he deals with one, and all of that one son's out of the two, he's going to focus on one of them. And that son's going to have 12 sons. And out of all of those 12 sons, although they all get a portion of it, he's going to focus his attention to one tribe, the tribe of Judah. And all the tribes of Judah, it's going to focus on one family, Jesse. And of all of Jesse's sons, it's going to focus on one, David. And all of David's sons, it's going to focus on one, Solomon. And of all of the descendants of Solomon, he's going to keep focusing the bloodline down until you come to the end of the Old Testament and you don't get an answer. There's no more king sitting on the throne. It's not math. I mean, I guess it is. A portion of it's math. But by the time you get to the Old Testament, you've narrowed this bloodline down so much that the first thing that you do if you turn over to the New Testament is you get a genealogy in Matthew, picking up with that specific bloodline, summarizing and boiling it all down to Joseph, a descendant of David in the exact right bloodline, and his firstborn son is Jesus. So you can't skip genealogies and pick up on what the Bible is laying down. Okay, so let's read Genesis 11. Casey, read Genesis 11, start in verse 27 and just read through 27 through 30. I'll fill in the names in case you have problems with it. So go ahead.
This is the account of
Terah's
family. Terah was the father of Abram.
Nahor and Haran.
Nahor and Hermon.
Haran, yeah.
Haran. And Haran was the father of Lot. But Haran died in Urim.
Of the Chaldeans.
Of the Chaldeans, the land of his birth. While his father Terah was still living. Meanwhile, Abram and Norah both married. The name of Abram's wife was
Sarai.
And the name of Norah's wife was
Milcah.
Milcah,
yes.
Milcah was her name. Isaac was daughter
Ishka. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Ishka.
That's not what mine says.
Yeah, yours is just putting the words in a different order and translating it. That's fine. Now just read verse 30.
But Sarai was unable to become pregnant and had no children.
Okay, good. Harley, take the mic, move it in front of you, and read 31 and 32. Just that much, please.
What is that?
Tara?
Okay. Look, his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son,
Haran.
and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out for
Ur of the Chaldeans.
to go to
Canaan.
Okay. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years and he died in Haran.
Okay, thank you both for reading that. You can move the mic just in general until we get to chapter 12. So this is immediately one genealogy is followed by another account, but it's a toledote. It's an account number 5 out of 10. It's a toledote, an account of Terah, and it's going to focus entirely on Abram. But first, we get in this section some historical and geographical background information. It's given to us before the story really begins because it needs the reader to pick up and understand some things the author wants to lay down. Okay? There's a few things worth noting here that set the stage for the actual story that's going to start in chapter 12. A few plot points, a few characters that we're going to end up following. One, let's talk about geographic origins. Abram's family originates in Ur of the Chaldeans. Let's look at a map, because when people talk about the origin of Abraham, while he's still Abram, there are two options for where Ur is. For 100 years, if we follow this orange line, there's an Ur down here that most people and most churches assume is the Ur. Now, a lot of this has to do with the fact that only recently have we discovered that there's a second Ur up here. 100 years ago, this guy excavated in the Babylonian area. See, Babylon is down here, and Ur is in this area. In Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, in Babylon. Chaldeans is an ancient designation for Babylon, just like Shinar is an ancient designation for the land itself. Here's the trouble with assuming that this is the location. The Babylonians were around for millennia, but they were only back here rebuilding this city and developing this culture down here at about 900 BC, which is roughly the time that Solomon is king. So Abram is like almost 2,000 years before Solomon. At this time, it does not appear that the Babylonians are back in this land. It appears that Ur of the Chaldeans, Ur is up here because they're not in the place that they're historically recognized later in time. So it is more likely, although let me just say, the jury is still out on which Ur it actually is. Yes, it could be this Ur down here, and they're using old designations for the Chaldeans, for the Babylonians, for a reason. But it could also be that they're calling it Ur of the Chaldeans because they're up here where they were called the Chaldeans. I'm more convinced these days that Ur of the Chaldeans is up here. But in the end, my point is it doesn't really matter. This is still the Babylonians. This is still the Babylonian system. But if it appears that they were somewhere down here building the Tower of Babel, that when God scattered the nations, that might have included the Babylonians, and that they scatter up here during the time of Abraham, and that yes, in history, they are eventually going to work their way back over here and maybe even rebuild a city and name it Ur after a city up here. You know, all of that can still be true. All of that can still be legitimate. But I think during Abram's time, this is a more likely bet. But the point is, it's still Babylon. It's just a much earlier, historically different set of Babylonians. But it's still the Babylonian system. It's still the people of Babel. It's still the ancient enemy of God. Just at a different point in time, they're located geographically different. But they're still really the same people. And their theology and their philosophy is still the same. So what's going to happen is they're going to travel here to Haran. There's a person named Haran and there's a city named Haran. If your translations are doing it right, there should be 2 R's in the city of Haran, 1 R in the person of Haran. So you can distinguish them based on that, otherwise read your context. And what's happened is they're going to go to Haran. Part of Abram's family is going to settle there. Terah and his son Nahor are going to live out their days here. And Terah is going to die here, and Abram's going to keep going on down to this particular part in Canaan. Canaan is this strip of land right here. Up here is the region of Hermon. You get all this. I've talked about Ugarit before. You can see Ugarit here. That's a very important Baal worship place for later Old Testament stories. Down here, this is Egypt, all that stuff. And so you're going to see Abram is going to continue on and journey here. The rest of his family is going to be located here in Haran. They will come back into the story during Abraham's son's lifetime and his grandson's lifetime. So you get the movement kind of here. This is what's going on geographically, and the author wants you to pick up on that. It doesn't matter ultimately which we're talking about, because it's still a designation for Babylon. The people of Babylon, before they were back in the city of Babylon, it's still the same people. And so what it does theologically in the story, Abram is connected to the rebellious nations of Babel, the nations God has just divorced and divided. And so God is telecasting a theological point in this story. Out of rebels, God is going to build a remnant from which he's going to restore RRR, great movie, by the way. Out of the rebels, he builds a remnant, and he's going to restore his creation. He's going to take his time doing it, but that is ultimately what is going to happen here. Any questions thus far? All right, let's keep going. So that's the geographic origins. Okay, I've already said all this. Sorry, I didn't realize it was on that next slide. Also, there's a bit of family details here. Abram's brother Nahor settles with their father in Haran. So we will return to this in the next generation after Abraham. But for now, we receive his brother Nahor's location, the location of his family, with the details that are going to help make sense of decision Abram's going to make later in life, but we're giving them now. So I want to mention this because this doesn't come up very often. In 1126, Terah becomes the father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran at the age of 70. Now, maybe it means he started having one of his sons. Maybe it means they're triplets. I tend to think that it probably means he started having kids at the age of 70. It does not probably mean that they're triplets. And he had all sons in his 70th year. But when he's 70, he becomes a dad. And and then he dies at the age of 205, according to chapter 11, verse 32. Potentially 130 years of living went by from Abraham's birth to his father's death. Abraham, as we're about to find out, is 75 years old himself when he leaves Haran to go down into Canaan. In all likelihood, Abraham left Haran while his father Terah still lived there with his brother Nahor. The less likely option is that Terah birthed Abraham at the age of 130 and then died when Abraham was 75 years later, at the age of 205, when Abraham was 75. Sorry, when Abraham was 75. But the more likely option is that he's living out his days. Terah, Abraham's father, is living out his days in Haran. Because Genesis does this. Genesis and Hebrew storytelling in general tends to jump ahead in time, tie up loose ends about characters they're not going to follow, and then flash back and continue the story back in time with the more important characters. So it's vastly more likely that Terah is just living out his days alive in Haran. Not that he dies at 205 and then Abraham takes off. But the reason I bring that up is because non-critical thinkers tend to preach more that way in that storyline in the text, rather than reading the text closely and realizing that there are other better options available for what's actually going on with the rest of Abraham's family. Haran's father's Lot Then he dies young before the family leaves the native city of Ur. As we'll see later, Lot is actually an important character to these Genesis narratives because he stays the closest to his uncle Abraham for the longest period of time. And then he'll eventually separate from Abraham, and then Abraham will go and rescue him, and then Abraham will pray for his rescue, and God will rescue him. And then some other stuff happens, but you get that. All right, one last thing before we dive into chapter 12. This comment, verse 30. Now Sarai was barren, she had no children. This is a somewhat offhanded comment in this section of historical and geographical background. And it's sandwiched kind of amidst the family details, and so it might seem unimportant when you're just reading it. But it's going to become the main plot point between Abram and Sarai, as she's still called, her name changes too. It's going to become the main plot point that God actually has to overcome. In fact, God picks this couple to make his promises to because they can't have children. And so we come to this tension in the text. God wants to work with humanity to rule the heavens and the earth, but we've so screwed up the world that we can't actually partner with God to restore it, even if we're willing. God, therefore, makes promises that cannot actually be filled by human agency alone. These promises that we're about to read require God's supernatural intervention in order to be fulfilled. In order for God to create his remnant of humanity and bring about restoration for his rebellious creatures, he takes a 75-year-old man and I think she's
like she's a million years old.
She's too old to have kids already. She's been through menopause. Her child-rearing days are behind her, and she hasn't had a baby. And God says, perfect. No, for God, this is perfect. This is absolutely perfect. Because when she has Isaac, the child of promise, there is no doubt in anybody's mind that this is God's supernatural intervention. That's how the Jews today read their story. They are created out of a supernatural birth. And when you read Jesus' story about a virgin conceiving, you're supposed to read it as saying, when God created the Hebrews, he created them out of a supernatural birth. When God is recreating humanity through Jesus, he does an even greater supernatural birth. And if you don't start by reading Abram's story, Sarai's story, Israel's story, the way they're reading it, you're going to miss these details. And you're going to misunderstand what the virgin birth is actually about in the mind of these people. Questions? Because they're, oh, baby. All right. So let's read. Grant, pull the mic in front of you. Read chapter 12. Read verses 1 through 3.
The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you."
Okay, so what's the first thing that you notice about these verses if you're just looking at them? What are they?
Kind of sounds like a poem.
Very good, Grant. These are poetic statements, and you can see I've kind of given you a visual here. This is not the text, but you can see what we've been doing here is we've been reading basic storylines, plot points and stuff, and then he jumps into these poetic statements, and then now in verse 4, he goes back to reading the narration again. So what do the poetic statements mean?
Pay attention.
They are important emphasis in the text, so pay attention. These are the promises of God, ultimately that through you and your family, all the nations are going to find God's blessings again. So, Logan, I want you to take the mic. I want you to read verses 4 and 5, just that much.
4 and 5?
4 and 5. And then, Allie, take the mic and read 6 and 7, please.
Okay. So Abram departed as the Lord had instructed, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran.
Haran, yes.
He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all his wealth, his livestock, and all the people he had taken into his household at Haran, and headed for the land of Canaan.
Canaan, yes.
When they arrived in Canaan, is that all?
Yes, and now, Allie, if you'll read verses 6 and 7, please.
When Abram traveled through the land as far as Shechem,
Shechem, yes.
there he set up camp beside the oak of Moreh. At the time, the area was inhabited by Canaanites. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your descendants. And Abram built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord.
Okay.
That appeared to him.
Okay. And just to conclude us, verses 8 and 9 said this, but we're not really going to deal with this week. We'll save that for next week. From there he went on to the hill countries of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to Yahweh and called on the name of Yahweh. So Abram set out and continued toward the Negev. Basically, he's moving south geographically. We'll talk about those details on another day. Let's talk about the details of this passage here. So, the question is, where did God's original calling to Abram take place? Now, we know from other Old Testament texts and New Testament texts, like Nehemiah 9:7 or Acts 7, that this is actually being spoken by Yahweh to Abram before he originally sets out to leave Ur of the Chaldeans. A close reading of 11:12 through 32 not only allows for this, it actually makes it the most probable reading. But he sets out with his family, his whole family, then some of his family stays in Haran, and then he keeps going. Hebrew storytelling tends not to tell stories by strict chronology. It tells things more topically than it does chronologically. So you don't need to force chapter 12, 1 through 3, into happening after the events of the family picking up and moving to Haran. You don't need to force that even in the Hebrew text, which is why in other Hebrew texts, they don't force that reading. Thus, verse 1, correctly translated in English, has the past tense. Now, Yahweh had said to Abram. Where had he said it? While they were still in Ur. That's the point. And plenty of other Old Testament, not to mention New Testament places, parse this out. Okay? So, that's where God had said this. And that's important, for out of Babel, Ur of the Chaldeans, out of the people, God is calling Abram. And that is geographically still telecast here. But what is he actually calling him away from, and what is he actually calling him towards? What had Yahweh said to Abram back in Ur? In a word, he said, leave. Leave your country, leave your people, and leave your father's household. And there you see Abram waving goodbye. Leave everything you know and everything you're used to, everything that makes you comfortable, and eventually I will show you where I want you to be. That is what God is essentially asking Abram to do. And here's the thing. Although in English you could say that these are commands, these are actually probably are not commands in Hebrew. It might be more accurate to translate these, if you will leave your land, your country, and your family, your father's household, and go to the land that I will show you. You should let me turn you into a great nation. You should let me bless you. You should let me do these things. So God is trying to partner with Abram and his family again. Question. Would you leave America? Would you leave Greenville, Texas, and your family to travel for an unknown amount of time?
Yes.
On foot?
Yes.
On foot, if it meant that you were following God?
Yes. That's what we did when we
Now-
went to the Dominican Republic.
Okay, but that was for a limited amount of time. God is telling Abraham, and this is the potential risk that he tells us all, leave everything that you know behind and never go back.
Yeah, I'll do it. I'll do it.
What if it wasn't merely about leaving things behind? What if God's promises were, I'm going to replace everything with even more than I'm asking you to give up? You have to think about these things, because what we're asked to replicate in faith is the same basic decision, or at least potentially the same basic decision that God called Abraham. To be new humans and partner with God, you have to leave some things behind. Sure, it's a free gift, but it cost everything. And you have to parse out what exactly it's going to cost you. And the things that you're most wanting to hold on to, you can be sure those are probably the things God is going to ask you to give up most, so that you most love Him in this life and choose Him above everything else. Let me point out one more thing that doesn't come up here. In sermons and stuff, it doesn't come up, but it's inherent in the ideas of the text if you think like an ancient. And in light of what we talked about the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, this is there. The country and the people are directly related to leaving the gods of those people in that land. These gods have been landlocked. They have been apportioned to the people in specific land. And when God is telling Abram, you and your family come out of this land, he's inherently asking him to leave the gods behind, according to the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Gods that Abram would have spent 75 years worshiping and bowing down to. It's like this. If you were thinking of it in degrees of circles, your closest relationships, the people are immediately around you, the most you're comfortable with, the land that you know, and ultimately the gods. Everything that you know and that makes your identity what it is. Leave it all behind and go to some place that I'll eventually show you. But when you set out, I'm not going to tell you where you're going. I'm going to ask you for faith. And that's what God is asking about. John Walton, noted Old Testament scholar, said this: he, Abram, must decide whether to abandon what family he still has in favor of the family Yahweh promises, against all logic, even Sarah's infertility. He must decide whether to set aside his blessing, which here likely means his inheritance from his father, his inheritance for the inheritance that Yahweh will describe, and much later on he's going to specify what that's going to mean. The initiative offers much, but its cost is significant. Abraham must trust Yahweh to deliver what he has offered in order to give up so much that Abram already stands to gain. This is a massive, massive act of faith here. God is asking Abraham to give up practically everything he's ever known. That's a powerful act of faith that Yahweh is asking for. But as a good king, Yahweh is binding himself to Abraham to give him infinitely more in return. The new humanity of God, the seed, will now be limited to Abram. The blessing of God's creation intentions, His purpose for all of humanity, will be recovering through Abraham and those like Abraham exercise faith in Yahweh. And He's still in the business of partnering with humans today to say, have faith like Abraham. Leave some things behind. And it may not be as drastic as Abraham, but leave some things behind, and I'll give you other things. And here's three big pictures, three big promises, three big ideas that God promises Abraham in exchange for leaving the land, his family, and the gods behind. One, I'll give you land. That land is the land of Canaan. In verse 7, I'll give you descendants, a family. I'll rebuild your family for you. And He gives you blessings. And these blessings can be later parsed into a great name, which should sound familiar. And then it means a lot of different things here in very broad respects. You will become the avenue for blessing other people. And in fact, through you, all peoples shall again be capable of receiving Yahweh's blessing. Now we're out of time, so we're going to stop here for today. But what I want you to see is in the big picture sense, that what we'll start breaking down in more detail tomorrow, is that everything here, stay with me here for another minute, everything here is designed to deal with the three rebellions that have already taken place. They've been exiled from Eden. They've been exiled from Babylon. Their descendants and their family are spreading out and multiplying according to God's gracious promises He gives. But their descendants are corrupt, and all of their blessings have been turned to curses since the garden. And so what the language here is reminiscent of all the prologue stuff already been spoken over and over again. So what I want you to do this week, a little bit of homework, is I want you to read this and see if you can parse out and tell me next Sunday Where do this language, where does this great name language already come up in Genesis? Before chapter 12. Where does the land and the descendants and the blessing ideas already come up? And be ready to tell me those specific verses next week.